Hi, I'm Chris, and I'm excited to show you the Segments tool from the Anim Toys tool pack for Blackmagic Fusion. The Segments tool allows you to create animations and designs based on repeated line segments and angles. The Segments tool is a very close relative to the Spiral tool, so I highly recommend you watch the tutorial video for the Spiral toolset, since in this video I'll only be covering the bits that are different on the Segments tool. I think of the Segments tool primarily as a design tool, where the designs are created in an animation context. In the Segments tool, the animation will move along the start heading at a speed of velocity. Then, after the number of frames set by turn frequency, the animation will turn. The size of the turn is determined by turn angle, and the turns will be repeated at the interval set by turn frequency. These settings create your basic shape. You can also use the turn softening control to round off the corners of the turns. This works better when you have a high turn frequency. You can change the aspect ratio of the animation. And of course, you can also use the wave controls, just like in the Spiral tool, to get much more interesting and complex shapes. When you find yourself creating complex shapes, you may need to work in a composition with thousands of frames. This may become very resource intensive, as the tool uses a simulation algorithm that needs to process each prior frame to calculate the current frame. If you find your machine is having trouble keeping up with the animation, you can select Show Saved here to prevent the Segments tool from trying to update the animation as you work on it. It will instead show you the last animation you saved by pressing the Save Segments data button. Now, you may have noticed that most of the controls on the Anim Toys tools are animatable using keyframes. In general, these tools are not actually designed for keyframe animation, and I just left the option open for adventurous folks who want to see what happens when they push beyond intended boundaries. In the case of the Segments tool, though, keyframes on certain controls can play an important role in generating interesting designs. Principal among these is the heading offset. This control will cause the path of the animation to deviate from the basic calculated path. Keyframing this over time can give you a twisting action that can be very useful. Now's a good time to take a quick detour to look at the one new thing in the Waves section, the Align Waves to Heading Offset. When using heading offset, you have two options for how the axes of the waveforms will be oriented. The more intuitive way is for the waves to continue to work along the heading that the object is traveling on. If you want this behavior, just leave the checkbox checked. The other option, which you'll get by unchecking the checkbox, will apply the waves before offsetting the heading. This is kind of complex to explain, so I suggest just trying it both ways to see which one you like better. Most of the time, you'll probably want to leave it checked. Coming back to keyframing, one very nice reason to keyframe the controls is to create a proper spiraling pattern. You can accomplish this using the velocity or with the turn frequency. Simply adding keyframes at the beginning and end of the composition on either of these controls can give you a nice spiral very quickly. If you want to be more precise about it, you can use the Polygon Spiral Creator. With this section, you can create all kinds of spirals based on your choice of regular equilateral polygon with very fine control. Let's look at the options for the Spiral Creator. Polygon sides defaults to 4, which will give you a squarish spiral. The number of sides will define what kind of polygon the spiral will look like. 3 will be a triangle, 8 will be an octagon, and so on. In-out lets you choose whether the animation starts at the outside of the spiral and moves in, or from the inside of the spiral moving out. Spiral direction selects whether to create the spiral in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction from the starting point. Spiral gap type allows you to set whether the gap between spirals is the same each time around, or if it reduces proportionally to the size of that spiral shape. Using proportional will give that kind of hallway or tunnel effect. Spiral width source selects how the initial gap between the spirals is chosen. Use gap width will use the value you set on the spiral gap width control. Fit will choose a starting gap that will make it so the spiral animation ends in the middle of the spiral exactly at its end frame. There are two ways we can set keyframes to create a spiraling shape. The simple way is to use the speed of the animation movement. We set keyframes on the velocity to slow it down so that each line segment is smaller than the last, if we're spiraling inward. When you're creating designs, I highly recommend you stick with velocity as your choice for the spiral method. However, if you're creating an animation and want to spiral at a constant speed, then keyframing on velocity will not suit you. In this case, you can select turn frequency as the spiral using method. This will keyframe the turn frequency value so that turns will happen more often as the spiral is created, so the line segments get shorter along the way. The benefit of this is that you maintain a constant speed for your animation, but there are a couple of downsides. First, since we're working with discrete frames when animating, the resulting spirals cannot be as clean and precise. If you're using them for animation, this probably won't be a problem, but for design they can look a little bit messy. The other downside is that if you choose turn frequency, you cannot use the next control on the list. The star intensity control allows you to take the polygon shape that your spiral is based on and turn it into a star shape. You must have velocity selected as the spiral using method for this to work. By default, star intensity is set to 0, which will leave the spiral as it is. Positive or negative values will bring the midpoints of each line segment closer or further from the center of the spiral, resulting in a star shape. This effect relies on the turn frequency, so you'll need to have a turn frequency set to at least 3 for this to work. Spiral start frame sets the frame at which the spiraling animation will start. Be aware that the velocity, turn frequency, and turn angle keyframes will be reset when creating your spiral. So if you want something specific to happen in the frames before the start frame, you will want to set keyframes for that to happen after you've created your spiral. Similarly, max spiral frames sets the maximum number of frames the spiral will take. If the end of the composition is reached before max spiral frames, then the end of the composition will be used for all calculations regarding the end of the spiral. One thing to remember with these settings is that they only control the creation of keyframes and not the operation of the segment tool's animation engine itself. So, if you start the spiral after the beginning of the composition or end the spiral before the end of the composition, the segments tool will still animate during the frames outside of the limits of the spiral creation. If you don't want this animation, be sure to set keyframes on velocity, turn frequency, and turn angle as needed to stop the animation. Finally, you've got the two buttons which control the spiral creation. When you press the Create Spiral button, it will go to the frame you've selected as the start frame and make note of the velocity, if you selected velocity as the spiral using method, or the turn frequency if that's what you chose. It will then reset the keyframes for that control and also for the turn angle. Then it will do the calculations and create the keyframes necessary to generate the spiral animation. If you want to try again, click the Clear Spiral keys, and the settings that have been saved from the starting frame of the spiral will be reset, allowing you to change parameters before clicking the Create Spiral button again. When you're first using the Segments tool, it may be a bit confusing to remember the steps necessary to get a new Polygon tool, especially if you're using the Polygon Spiral Creator. Those steps are: if you're using the Spiral Creator, set the velocity and turn frequency to start. Then select your options in the Spiral Creator, then press the Create Spiral button. This step creates the keyframes which the tool will then interpret to create the animation. If you're happy with the base spiral, go back to the basic rotation and waves controls to tweak the animation as desired. Click the Save Segments Data button. This is a critical step because the Create Polygon button, which you'll click next, requires that data to be saved in order to make the new Polygon tool. Thanks for taking the time to learn about the Segments tool from the Anim Toys toolpack. I can't wait to see what you'll make with it. Please comment below if you have anything cool you want to share. The link to get the Anim Toys pack is in the description, and check out these other videos to learn more about Anim Toys.